The 17th of January, 1943. Bougainville Island, South Pacific. The jungle breathes with a suffocating wetness. Steam rises from the black mud where a young Marine from Ohio lies crumpled against the roots of a banyan tree, his left leg shattered by Japanese machine gun fire. The morphine syringe hangs empty from his collar. He can hear the distant thump of artillery, the screech of macaws, and something else, a sound that doesn't belong to this green hell. A droning hum, growing louder. Through the canopy breaks, he sees it. A C-47 transport plane, its twin engines roaring as it descends toward a makeshift airstrip carved from the jungle floor. He doesn't know it yet, but that sound, that mechanical thunder cutting through the ancient silence of the Pacific, is the sound of a revolution being born from desperation. For centuries, wounded soldiers died where they fell, or lingered for days in agony as they were carried by stretcher, by wagon, by mule train toward distant hospitals. In the First World War, men bled out in the mud of no man's land, waiting for stretcher-bearers who might never come. The time between wound and surgeon was measured in hours, sometimes days, and time, in the mathematics of trauma, is measured in lives. The golden hour, that critical window, when intervention means survival, was a luxury that belonged only to those injured, within walking distance of a field hospital. Everyone else simply prayed, or died quietly. When America entered the Second World War in December 1941, its military medical system was built on the assumptions of ground warfare. Ambulances, hospital trains, ship evacuations. The doctrine was linear, terrestrial, slow. The Marine Corps had 4,000 hospital beds prepared for the entire Pacific theater. 4,000 beds for a war that would stretch across 10 million square miles of ocean, jungle, and coral. The Army Air Forces had no dedicated air evacuation service, no protocols, no specially trained flight nurses, no standardized litter configurations for aircraft. The C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the Douglas DC-3, was designed to drop paratroopers and cargo, not to carry shattered men across 1,000 miles of hostile sky. But the Pacific would not permit old solutions. This was not the Western Front, where railways connected the trenches to rear hospitals, where the distances were cruel but conquerable. In the Pacific, a wounded man on Guadalcanal was 800 miles from the nearest base hospital in New Caledonia. A soldier hit on New Guinea faced a sea voyage of 5 days through submarine-infested waters, burning with fever, his wounds festering in the tropical heat. The jungles consumed men as efficiently as bullets did. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, infections that turned minor wounds into death sentences. The old system wasn't just inadequate, it was impossible. And so, quietly, without fanfare or formal authorization, pilots began making the choice. After dropping supplies at forward airstrips, they looked at the rows of wounded men lying in tent hospitals and decided not to return empty. They loaded casualties onto bare metal floors, strapped litters to cargo tie-downs, and flew them out. These were not mercy flights in any official sense. They were improvisation, desperation, a pilot's refusal to let cargo space return unused while men died waiting for ships that might arrive too late. In February 1943, a young flight surgeon named David Sherman was stationed in Port Moresby, New Guinea. He watched wounded men wait 7, 8, 9 days for sea evacuation. He watched infections spread. He watched men lose limbs that might have been saved, and he watched C-47 seconds fly overhead, empty, returning to Australia after resupply runs. Sherman approached his commanding officer with a proposal that violated every regulation in the manual: use the returning aircraft as flying ambulances. The response was bureaucratic refusal. There were no provisions for in-flight medical care, no trained personnel, no authorization from Washington. Sherman ignored the refusal. He scrounged stretcher brackets from Navy wreckage, trained ground medics in emergency airborne procedures, and on his own authority began loading planes. The first official air evacuation flight from the South Pacific lifted off on the 20th of February 1943. 5 patients, a single medic, a pilot who had never carried wounded before. The flight took 4 hours instead of 9 days by ship. Every one of those men survived. Word spread. Pilots began requesting wounded passengers. Field hospitals started prioritizing cases by flight availability rather than ship schedules. By March, hundreds of men were being evacuated weekly. By June, thousands. What the Japanese command could not comprehend, what their intelligence officers noted with confusion in intercepted reports, was the speed of American casualty return. Japanese wounded often remained in forward aid stations for weeks, their conditions deteriorating, their survival rates plummeting. Japanese hospital ships moved at the pace of tradition, of doctrine written for another kind of war. They assumed their enemy faced the same limitations. They were wrong. American casualties were vanishing from the battlefield and reappearing in rear hospitals with a velocity that defied traditional warfare. It was as if the Americans had discovered a form of medical teleportation. The German Wehrmacht, fighting in North Africa and later Europe, encountered the same phenomenon. In Tunisia, a captured Luftwaffe officer expressed bewilderment during interrogation. He had observed American transport planes landing under artillery fire, loading wounded and departing within minutes. He had seen men shot in the morning, fighting again within months, men who by all traditional calculations should have died or been permanently invalided. He asked his interrogator a simple question: "How many hospital planes do you have?" The answer unsettled him. America didn't have hospital planes. It had cargo planes that became hospitals when needed, and cargo again when not. The distinction seemed trivial until its implications became clear. American logistics weren't built on specialized redundancy, but on flexible adaptation. Every plane was every plane. By 1944, the air evacuation system had evolved from improvisation into doctrine. Flight nurses, women who were both trained medical professionals and rated aircrew, flew combat missions without weapons or armor, tending to patients at 12,000 feet in unpressurized cabins where temperatures dropped below freezing. They administered plasma, monitored respirations, stabilized fractures, and performed emergency tracheotomies in turbulence that threw unsecured equipment across the fuselage. The C-47 seconds were retrofitted with standardized litter brackets that could hold 24 stretcher patients, or a mix of litters and walking wounded. Oxygen systems were installed. Medical kits were standardized. Procedures were written, revised, practiced. Lieutenant Lillian Kinkeler flew her first evacuation mission over the Himalayas, the Hump, as pilots called it, that terrifying route from India to China, where altitude, weather, and mountains killed more airmen than enemy fire. She was 23 years old. Her patient was a Chinese soldier with a sucking chest wound, barely conscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. At 14,000 feet, in an unpressurized cabin where the air was thin as hope, she monitored his vitals, adjusted his oxygen flow, kept his airway clear. The flight took 3 hours through mountain passes where the peaks rose higher than the plane's service ceiling, where ice formed on the wings and visibility vanished into cloud. He survived. So did she. 2 weeks later, she flew again. The statistics tell a story that numbers rarely capture. In World War I, the mortality rate for wounded who reached medical care was 8%. In World War II, for those evacuated by air, it was less than 1%. Consider that figure. 99 out of every 100 wounded soldiers who boarded an evacuation flight survived. The speed of evacuation had compressed the golden hour into the golden minutes. A Marine shot on Iwo Jima could be in a surgical hospital in Guam within 3 hours. A soldier wounded in France could be in England before sunset. Time, the ancient enemy of battlefield medicine, had been conquered by altitude and engine power. German military physicians studied captured American medical manuals with growing alarm. The Luftwaffe had its own air ambulance service, but it was specialized, limited, doctrine-bound. It required dedicated aircraft, formal authorization, rear area operations. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have weaponized flexibility itself. Any pilot could become an ambulance driver. Any plane could become a hospital. The system scaled infinitely because it wasn't really a system, it was a philosophy embedded so deeply in American logistics that even the Germans, masters of operational planning, couldn't replicate it. Their war machine was built on precision and specialization. America's was built on abundance and adaptation. This abundance manifested in ways both material and conceptual. Japanese soldiers on bypassed Pacific islands, starving and isolated, would hear the daily drone of American transport planes flying overhead, dozens of them, hundreds, carrying supplies, reinforcements, and on the return journey, wounded. The sound became a form of psychological warfare. It represented not just American material superiority, but temporal superiority. The Americans could afford to use cargo space for broken men. They had so many planes, so much fuel, so much organizational excess, that they treated human salvage as routine logistics. To a Japanese soldier trained in the code of Bushido, where wounded were often left to die or expected to take their own lives rather than burden the unit, this was incomprehensible. The Americans fought as if every life had infinite value, as if the individual soldier was worth the expenditure of aircraft, fuel, and crew risk. It was an ideology written in kerosene and aluminum. Captain John Hennessy, a flight surgeon who flew 143 evacuation missions over Europe, wrote in his diary an observation that cuts to the philosophical heart of the airlift revolution. Today, we flew a private with a leg wound and a colonel with a skull fracture on the same plane. The nurse treated the private first because his bleeding was worse. No one questioned this. In the air, rank dissolves. There is only the wound and the treatment. I think this is the most democratic thing I have ever witnessed. Democracy, in this context, was not merely political, it was operational. The air evacuation system treated all casualties with identical urgency. There were no class distinctions at altitude. The speed of the plane erased the privileges of position. A general and a rifleman received the same priority if their injuries demanded it. This was not idealism, it was triage, rationalized by technology. But to the Axis powers, whose military cultures were built on rigid hierarchies and explicit class structures, it appeared as something more. Evidence that American equality wasn't just propaganda, but a structural feature of their war machine. Consider the symbolic weight of the C-47 itself. This was not a weapon. It carried no bombs, no guns beyond defensive armament. It was a transport, a workhorse, utterly unsexy in the mythology of air power. Yet it became the most vital aircraft of the war, more essential than the B-17, more ubiquitous than the P-51. Eisenhower called it one of the 4 weapons that won the war. The C-47 landed on improvised strips in jungles, deserts, mountains. It flew through flak and fighters without armor or speed. It delivered everything: ammunition, food, medicine, mail, hope. And on the return flight, it carried away the cost, the wounded, the broken, the survivors. It was the logistical embodiment of a nation that could afford to care for its casualties, that possessed the industrial base to build 10,000 aircraft that could serve dual purposes, that had the cultural imperative to try. By late 1944, the air evacuation network stretched across the entire global theater. From Pacific atolls to Alaskan tundra, from North Africa to Burma, wounded men were being moved by air. The 349th Air Evacuation Squadron logged over 3 million patient miles without a single in-flight fatality. Nurses flew through typhoons, over active battlefields, into airstrips under artillery fire. They delivered babies at 8,000 feet, performed emergency amputations with pocket knives, held dying men's hands as the engines roared. They were not combat troops by designation, but they earned air medals, Purple Hearts, and in one case, the Silver Star. Second Lieutenant Aleda Lutz flew 196 evacuation missions, more than any other flight nurse in the war. She carried over 3,500 patients from North Africa to Italy to France. On the 1st of November 1944, her C-47 crashed in poor weather near Lyon, France. She was 29 years old. Her body was found in the wreckage, still holding a patient's hand. She was the first American military woman killed in the line of duty in a combat zone during World War II. Her death was not anomalous heroism. It was the logical endpoint of a system that placed medical personnel into the same danger as infantry, because the system valued speed over safety, recovery over caution. The Japanese never developed an equivalent system. Their cultural framework could not accommodate it. The concept of expending scarce resources, fuel, aircraft, crew, hours on men already wounded, contradicted the ethos of self-sacrifice and collective priority. Japanese military medicine remained ground-bound, ship-dependent, slow. Their wounded died in greater numbers, not because their physicians were less skilled, but because their logistics were philosophically constrained. They could not imagine, let alone implement, a system where the individual soldier's survival justified such extravagant expenditure. The Germans came closer. By 1945, facing total collapse, the Luftwaffe began emergency air evacuations from the Eastern Front, flying wounded out of encircled cities like Breslau and Budapest. But these were desperate improvisations, not systemic doctrine. They lacked the trained personnel, the standardized equipment, the cultural expectation of success. German air evacuations were tragic last resorts. American air evacuations were Tuesday. And this, perhaps, is the deepest revelation of the airlift revolution. It was not primarily a technological achievement, but a cultural one. The technology existed before the war. The DC-3 first flew in 1935. The innovation was not the plane, but the decision to use it this way. The willingness to risk expensive aircraft and trained crews for casualties. The organizational flexibility to convert cargo space into hospital wards without formal authorization. The democratic impulse to treat a private's injury as worth the same flight time as an officer's. These were choices rooted in values, not capabilities. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe ended, American transport planes began the largest air evacuation in history, bringing home tens of thousands of liberated prisoners of war and wounded soldiers from across Europe. The flights ran continuously, day and night, a ceaseless bridge across the Atlantic. C-54 Skymasters, the four-engine successors to the C-47, carried patients directly from Germany to America, non-stop flights of 14 hours. Men who had been wounded in the Bulge were in stateside hospitals within 48 hours. The speed was incomprehensible to their own minds. They fell asleep over Germany and woke over Newfoundland. Time and space had been annihilated by velocity. A German prisoner of war, an officer who had fought in North Africa, witnessed one of these mass evacuations from a POW camp in France. He watched, day after day, as American planes landed, loaded with wounded, and departed. He counted them 40, 50, 60 flights in a single day from one airfield. In his interrogation, he was asked what had most surprised him about American military capability. He did not mention tanks or bombs or ships. He mentioned the planes that came for the wounded. He said, "You value your soldiers more than your victories. I did not understand this was a strength until I saw it." He was wrong, of course, in his binary framing. America valued both, but his confusion illuminates a truth. The air evacuation system was not charity or sentiment, it was strategic. Every wounded soldier who survived and recovered was a trained veteran who could return to duty or, at minimum, return home to tell the story of how the system saved him. The psychological impact on troops was incalculable. American soldiers fought, knowing that if they were hit, the full weight of industrial and organizational power would focus on their survival. This was not a promise, it was demonstrated reality. The sound of cargo planes overhead was the sound of institutional commitment to individual life. By the war's end, over 1 million patients had been evacuated by air across all theaters. The mortality rate for air-evacuated wounded remained below 1%. The flight nurses had flown through every climate, every combat zone, every emergency. They had proven that medical care could be delivered anywhere, at any altitude, under any conditions. The technology was simple litters, oxygen, plasma, morphine. The execution was anything but. It required courage, training, improvisation, and an organizational culture willing to prioritize life over doctrine. In the decades after the war, air evacuation became standard military practice. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, every American war refined the system that was born in improvisation over Bougainville. The helicopter replaced the C-47 for frontline extraction, but the principle remained: speed saves lives. The golden hour became doctrine. Medics and corpsmen trained to stabilize and extract within minutes. Field hospitals moved closer to the fighting. The entire architecture of military medicine reoriented around the lessons learned when a few pilots decided not to fly home empty. There is a photograph, taken in 1944, of a C-47 interior over France. 23 litters are visible, stacked 3 high along the fuselage walls. In the foreground, a flight nurse, her uniform crisp despite the cramped conditions, checks an IV line on a soldier whose face is bandaged. Sunlight streams through the small windows. The image is mundane in its composition, but radical in its implications. This is an assembly line in reverse. Instead of building machines from components, it is rebuilding men from fragments. And it is happening at 200 miles per hour, 6,000 feet above enemy territory. The recurring symbol of American abundance in this story is not a weapon or a ration, it is the empty seat. The cargo space that could have carried ammunition or fuel, but instead carries a wounded man home. In every other military force, this was waste. In the American system, it was investment. The empty seat on the return flight represented a choice. We will not leave you behind. We will not consider you expendable. We will expend the resources to bring you back. This choice cost fuel, crew hours, aircraft wear. It diverted planes from other missions. By strict utilitarian calculation, it was inefficient. By human calculation, it was priceless. The Marine on Bougainville, the one we began with, lying in the mud listening to the engines, did board that C-47. He was carried on a litter by 2 corpsmen and loaded through the cargo door. Inside, the plane was already crowded with wounded. A flight nurse took his vitals, adjusted his morphine, covered him with a blanket. The engines roared. The plane lifted. Through the open door, he saw the jungle fall away, saw the green canopy shrink to texture, saw the island become an abstraction. 4 hours later, he was on Guadalcanal. A week later, he was in Auckland. 6 weeks later, he was in San Francisco. He lost the leg, but not his life. He went home. He married his high school sweetheart. He had children. He lived to be 83 years old. He was one of a million, each one a statistic, each one a person who continued to exist because someone decided that empty cargo space was an obscenity when wounded men needed seats. The airlift didn't just save lives, it demonstrated a principle: that human life has absolute value, that individual survival justifies collective effort. That democracy is not just a political system but a moral arithmetic where every citizen counts, even when counting is expensive. The sky above Bougainville is quiet now. The airstrips are gone, reclaimed by jungle. The C-47 seconds are museum pieces, or converted to cargo haulers in remote places. The flight nurses are dead or dying, their stories fading. But the principle endures. When a Marine is hit in Helmand Province, a helicopter comes. When a soldier is wounded in a future war not yet imagined, someone will come for him. Not because it is efficient, but because it is essential. Because the sound of engines overhead is the sound of a promise kept. Because empty seats are heavier than any cargo when weighed against a life. And that is the true weight of the airlift revolution. It transformed rescue from chance into certainty, from mercy into doctrine, from hope into thunder.